Chapter 19. Ally or Enemy. The alien-made metal platform raised Saberclaw, Rebay, and Lockjaw up to the 20th floor of the warship. The robots had spoken no words through the entire tour, but the alien queen had not gone a minute without saying something. Saberclaw looked around, taking in everything around her. Saberclaw's actual conscience had no control over her body. It was like a ghost of Rebay was controlling her body, and she was just panicking as she watched. The warship was very large, although the halls were barely large enough for Lockjaw to walk through without lowering his head in order to not hit the ceiling. Bright, pale, white lights pulsed overhead and made the entire corridor glow with an eerie light. The actual walls had unusual curves to them and were a deep purple color. The floors must have been some sort of metal because Saberclaw's armor and Lockjaw's armor clanked against it with every step. Rebay gestured wildly as she spoke about some sort of bloodbath adventure she went on at some point. After a few minutes of listening to Rebay's chatter and the clanking of armor, the three of them walked through the hallway and down a larger hallway. This hallway was about twice the size of the previous one and had large cells lining each wall. The cells had thick, strong bars blocking the cells from the hallway. As Saberclaw walked by, she looked inside the cells. Almost every cage was filled with countless creatures who were obviously not Nextari and not from Earth. Rebay must have imprisoned these beings after she conquered their planets. This seemed cruel to Saberclaw, and she desperately wanted to free the poor creatures, but she had to free her own mind first. The creatures were pressed against the back walls of each cell because they probably didn't want to be seen in such terrible states. They avoided the light from the hallway like it would burn them. Some of them even had the audacity to shoot her dirty or pitying looks. Finally, Lockjaw spoke quietly to Saberclaw as Rebay talked louder. "Well, what do you think, newbie?" He was trying to be friendly, and Saberclaw wanted to converse with him. However, the ghost that was controlling her body spoke for her. "Don't talk unto the queen. She is speaking, and you should listen, soldier." She referred to Lockjaw so simply and spoke in such a stern tone that it disappointed him. He was used to Saberclaw's bright, cute, and bold personality, and he had fallen for that Saberclaw. However, this version was dull, boring, and bland, and he hated it. He looked down, clearly being silenced by Saberclaw, and began thinking on why she was acting so differently than before. Neither of them knew the truth to each other's behavior. In Saberclaw's case, Rebay had her almost completely without control of her body and made her completely loyal. On the other hand, she had put less effort into Lockjaw and let him have majority of his bodily functions and let him control his words. Although he had been brainwashed into thinking that he was completely loyal to Rebay and was probably created by her. Lockjaw wondered why Saberclaw was so emotionally distant, but he knew better than to pry. However, Rebay kept chattering through their quickly shut-down conversation. She almost completely controlled Saberclaw's words, and completely knew that Lockjaw had attempted a connection. However, it didn't take much focus to control Saberclaw's actions. She put much of the effort into keeping Saberclaw's mind at bay. Saberclaw had very strong control over herself, and that included her feelings, and Rebay had to put much effort into mind controlling Saberclaw. To the alien queen, Saberclaw was like a horse that refused to be ridden. Rebay had enough power to control Saberclaw and Lockjaw while handling her own activities easily. Rebay turned around and spoke directly to Saberclaw. "Well, how about we test out your mysterious powers that threw me across a field? I am very interested in how you can help with the Nextari cause." She clapped her hands together and veered off to look into one of the cages. The prisoners inside all gasped with fear and pushed themselves against the back wall. They were obviously trying to avoid Rebay and her piercing gaze at the same time, but Rebay pressed a button on the wall next to the cell. The button glowed red and the large bars of the cell raised slowly. Rebay's presence seemed to scare the creatures enough that they wouldn't try to escape, and she stood threateningly in front of them. Saberclaw looked around the cage and got a better look at the things inside. It was an empty room, but was filled with aliens, and there even was what seemed to be a few younglings inside. The younglings clung to what must be their parents in fear. Rebay smirked when she saw this and nodded to Saberclaw as she pointed to one of the creatures. Use your ability on that one. I don't care what you do, but make it impressive and a little frightening. She shook with excitement as Saberclaw stepped forward. Lockjaw watched her with unsure curiosity. The Saberclaw he knew wouldn't hurt any of the prisoners, even if she had a gun to her head, so he was intrigued and a little scared to see what would happen. Inside Saberclaw's head, she was desperately fighting to escape. She wanted more than anything to free the prisoners instead of hurting them, but Rebay's grip on her refused to let her disobey. Saberclaw's head twitched and her eyes flickered, making Rebay afraid because she feared that Saberclaw would actually break her control. However, Saberclaw's arm finally raised her hand to the prisoner and summoned the golden strings. In everyone but Saberclaw's perspective, the creature began clutching its neck tightly and gasping for air. It began floating upward as Saberclaw raised her hand higher in the air. The alien creature struggled and rubbed its neck in pain, occasionally crying out some inaudible language. Rebay clapped her hands together as Saberclaw dropped the creature. About 3 other prisoners rushed over to the victim, comforting it and staring wildly at Saberclaw. Rebay laughed and jokingly punched Saberclaw's arm. Wow, you're going to do some real damage with that ability. Impressive. She trailed off as she blissfully thought of all the deaths Saberclaw was going to cause for her. Lockjaw stared in disbelief as Saberclaw emotionlessly stared at the prisoner who was now struggling to breathe. Lockjaw was surprised to catch himself not expecting Saberclaw to actually carry out Rebay's cruel command. Saberclaw would never have hurt the poor creature, but Rebay's control over her was too strong. Inside Saberclaw's mind, she fought for control with everything she had. She was constantly trying to focus her thoughts and command the slightest movement, but every thought ran from her with a pinch of pain, and the dark being controlling her stopped every movement like a thick wall. She felt like she was trapped in her own mind, but it felt like a nightmare. Rebay closed the cell and walked away, and the 2 robots followed her. The next Tari began chattering about her future plans again, but couldn't stop thinking about how effortlessly, emotionlessly, and silently Saberclaw had chalked the prisoner. She became giddy as she described her future assault on Earth. Lockjaw waited until Rebay paused, then he asked, "Wait, what about the other Sentiron, Your Highness? We have Saberclaw now, but what about Silverspot and Razorwing?" He was curious about what Rebay's plan for them was because she hadn't mentioned it yet. Rebay turned to face him, but didn't stop walking forward. "Well, I'm hoping that they come to their senses and surrender because they don't stand a chance. However, if they don't, then I will let you crush them, Saberclaw," she exclaimed. She was actually excited to see her new lackey destroy her own former teammates. Saberclaw put her head down in submission when she heard this, but she was screaming protests in her head. The 3 of them walked to the end of the hallway where a large, decorated door stood. Rebay opened the door, and they continued into a very large room. The room had 4 walls that curved into a dome. Each wall was lightly decorated, but the wall directly in front of them was mostly clear. They could see straight through it and out into space. The view of Earth from outside its atmosphere was breathtaking, but Saberclaw's face remained expressionless. Each wall was lined with alien consoles and Nextari soldiers furiously working on the consoles. Rebay walked through the room to a large throne that overlooked Earth. She sat down on the throne, and her tentacles swayed wildly. Saberclaw and Lockjaw stood beside Rebay's throne loyally as they looked out at the peaceful planet called Earth. Meanwhile, on Earth, Silverspot and Razorwing and the humans were trekking through the woods. Birds chirped cheerfully in the leaves overhead, but the Sentiron team's hearts were anything but cheerful. They were walking in silence, each of them wondering how they could have prevented the loss of Saberclaw. The brown and orange pine needles crunched beneath their boots as they walked, and branches snapped since neither of the robots were focused enough to avoid the trees. As the group came to a familiar clearing, the birds stopped singing, giving the moment an eerie aura. The green grass was stained with purple and blue-green liquid that Silverspot recognized as blood and G that had been spilled. Lila gasped when she noticed all of the dried liquid and looked up and Silver Spot for answers. Silver Spot looked down at her with a pitying look and explained, "This is where we fought Ri-Bei and her army. It is also where Saberclaw was critically injured." She spoke with a nostalgic but somewhat empty tone. Lila stared at the liquids in fear, but realized that there was more purple liquid than blue-green liquid. John leaned down and brushed his hands against the multicolored grass and imagined what it was like during this battle. He imagined Saberclaw on the ground, losing more G than she should have been, and had to force the thought out of his mind. Razorwing collapsed to his knees in sorrow. He felt empty inside now that Saberclaw's voice was no longer teasing him every few minutes. He originally was annoyed by her habits, but now he missed them. Sam comforted Razorwing silently as he looked around the clearing. Among the grass, he could see small chunks of flesh that were probably ripped off in the battle, but there were no bodies. Ri-Bei must have come back and collected them at some point. Then, among a thin pile of rocks, the group noticed a red gleam. Razorwing walked closer to the small light, slightly curious about what it was. He reached into the pile of rocks and pulled out one of his throwing stars. It was covered in purple Nextari blood, but it still had its bright red paint. Razorwing examined the star for a second, then tossed it away angrily where everyone could see. He couldn't stand the thought of using it after it had been covered in blood the way it was, especially since it held painful memories of Saberclaw. He growled at it angrily and paced, saying, "Why did it have to be her? Why not me or anyone else?" he yelled, frustrated. Silver Spot sighed and answered, "Because Saberclaw is the only one who has the power to defeat Ri-Bei. That's why she took her instead of anyone else. Lockjaw was just a bonus." She took a step forward into the middle of the clearing. She remembered the very spot where Saberclaw laid on the ground, dying. She also could envision the very spot where Ironstripe was held hostage with her and Razorwing. She became angry at the thought of Ironstripe watching her get hurt and humiliated by Ri-Bei and not doing anything to stop the alien queen. She thought of his betrayal and hated that she had ever trusted him. She didn't care if he did it to protect her. Saberclaw didn't deserve such a terrible fate, but this all had happened because Silver Spot didn't take the time to further question her partner's actions. This realization made Silver Spot put her head down. Now, not just the birds were silent, but all movement seemed to be paused. Lila thought about how unusual this was, but was too consumed by sad thoughts that she didn't think much of it. In fact, to Lila, it was like all of the forest was sad as well. Lila and the two men were standing close, comforting one another when something unexpected happened. A banging sound rang out from the dark woods and made Lila turn around quickly toward the sound. She looked just in time to see a large, rope-like net cast itself over her, Sam and John. Silver Spot and Razorwing, hearing the humans' fearful calls for help, whipped around and brought out their blasters. They were prepared to shoot, but didn't know what to aim at until they saw the humans engulfed by a thick netting. Silver Spot rushed over and was about to cut the net with one of her arrows when she was hit by some sort of sound wave. She dropped the arrow and clutched her audio receptors that allowed her to hear. She cried out as pain rushed through her head and throbbed through her upper body. Soon, the pain had traveled to her entire body and she ached everywhere. The sound waves were barely visible and pulsed a glowing yellow color. She felt her body go limp and she collapsed to the ground. She was completely conscious, but she couldn't move at all. She could see through her optics, but she couldn't move them to see around her. She saw a Razorwing rush over and try to shake her to her senses. However, she couldn't move or speak, so Razorwing gave up and tried to free the humans. Razorwing used a throwing star to cut a few of the ropes that were keeping the humans still. His star was very sharp, so it sliced through the rope easily. He looked up and saw many small silhouettes emerging from the darkness of the woods. To his surprise, the silhouettes stepped into the sunlight and revealed themselves to be carrying large guns. Razorwing gasped from shock when he realized that the attackers were a very large number of humans with thick armor. Razorwing stood up and bent over to make himself look slightly less threatening as he called out, "Wait, stop! We won't hurt you all. Let's just talk about this dash. He was interrupted by a rocket that zipped by his head. He looked in the direction of where the rocket was launched and saw 4 humans managing a large rocket launcher that looked very dangerous. Razorwing once again tried to reason with the humans, who were probably soldiers. Come on, humans. I am literally here to protect you, so why are you shooting at me? Free my friends and reverse whatever you did to Silver Spot. Please. He had to dodge another rocket that was headed for his lower body. As he dodged the second rocket, a large tank-like contraption fired the sound waves again at Razorwing. He was engulfed by the sound waves and began struggling to find his footing. Pain shot through him as the waves of sound entered his head. He stumbled backwards and bore his metal teeth at the humans as he kneeled. He began losing control of his motor functions and fell to the ground. All he could do was watch as a large truck rolled towards him and Silver Spot. The 3 humans struggled, but were freed from the net and handcuffed by some of the heavily armored soldiers. The truck stopped right in front of Silver Spot's frozen body and backed up to place itself right in front of her. She watched as the large door slowly lowered itself to the ground, and many soldiers tied thick cables to her limbs. The cables tightened and dragged Silver Spot into the closed trailer of the large truck. The same thing happened with Razorwing's limp body as Lila screamed for him to get up. John was shouting commands to Razorwing, hoping that he would stop messing around and stand up. Sam was yelling at the soldiers to let them go and that this was all a big misunderstanding. However, all of the soldiers ignored them and moved the 3 humans into another, smaller vehicle. The army of soldiers swiftly marched away behind the trucks, tanks, and vehicles. All Razorwing could see was darkness and the glow of Silver Spot's pale eyes. He tried to speak to Silver Spot, but he couldn't move his mouth or even make any sound. Silver Spot was also trying to speak, fight, or do anything in general, but her body was completely frozen. Meanwhile, the humans were sitting in silence as the car that contained them drove out of the woods and onto the road. Lila looked behind them and saw the soldiers who were on foot get into many cars and follow them. Sam had no idea where they were going, but reassured his daughter by holding her hand tightly. John was angry, to put simply. He couldn't contain his frustration any longer and asked the driver of the vehicle, "Who are you? What are you doing with our robots? Where are we going?" he asked with annoyance in his voice. The 3 were crammed in the back seat of the car with Sam in the middle and Lila and John on either side of him. The car was painted black, as well as all of the other vehicles following them. The driver was wearing dark clothes with a strange gold badge pinned to the pocket on his shirt. The driver, without looking at John, said, "That is classified information." The driver, who was a man, reached up above the mirror in the center of the windshield and held down a button. A black tinted glass raised up between the front 2 seats and blocked Lila, John, and Sam off from talking to the driver. Lila looked offended. "Ugh, rude," she exclaimed, hoping that the driver would hear her. John looked out the window at his surroundings since the driver was no help to him. They were on some sort of interstate highway, and countless cars passed them every few minutes. The trees and buildings flashed past them as they entered a small city. Tall buildings rose high above the car as the convey made its way through the city. After about an hour of driving, the car turned off of the highway and onto some back road. Trees moved past them as the car bumped up and down through the dirt road. Then, the road ended in front of a mountain. It was like the mountain had been dropped on the road. However, the car didn't stop or even slow down. It went straight towards the mountain, as if the large rock wasn't there. Lila began to panic as they got dangerously close to the mountain, but didn't slow down. She buried her face in her father's jacket with fear as she awaited the car's crash into the mountain. However, she looked up just in time to see a chunk of the mountain phase out. It disappeared, and the car went straight through it into what looked like a tunnel. All 3 humans looked behind them to see the convoy of vehicles phasing through the mountain as well. Sam concluded that the mountain must have been a hologram because it seemed to go back to normal once all of the cars and trucks had passed through it. The tanks and the truck containing the robots must have taken a different route because John realized that they weren't following them, but were in the large room that they had now entered. The room was dimly lit by white lights built into the ceiling and walls. The room was basically a large parking lot that all of the cars, except the trucks, stopped and parked in. The driver must have gotten out because he opened the door on John's side of the car. Two other soldiers grabbed Sam and Lila as the driver held on to John. The six of them walked across the parking lot and went to a door in one of the walls. The soldier, holding on to Lila without letting go of her, opened the door and walked inside the room with the others following him. The room was just like the underground parking lot, but instead of painted concrete floors, it had large, empty cells. All of the cells were empty except one, which Silver Spot and Razorwing lay on the floor in. Each of the cells was connected to a wall and had thick bars on all other sides, caging in whatever would be inside. There's also large consoles in front of each cell. The armored soldiers forcefully shoved the three humans into one of the cells across from Razorwing and Silver Spot. Then the soldiers stood at attention in front of the closed cell that now held the humans. Lila watched with relief as Silver Spot and Razorwing sat up slowly. She now knew that they were okay. Silver Spot looked around the cell and saw the three humans in the cell in front of her. She looked to the side and saw Razorwing, who was staring at his fingers in disbelief as he opened and closed his palm. She rolled her eyes at him, but her attention was diverted to the human-sized door as it opened forcefully. Two men walked in. One had bright red hair and a white shirt tucked into his jeans. The other man had white hair and wrinkles that showed his age. He also had a grayish-green suit and a sour expression plastered on his face. Razorwing looked up at the two men and immediately got a bad feeling about the older one and good vibes from the other, younger and calm-looking man. He glowered at the older man as he walked up to his cell. The older man smiled smugly as he looked up at Razorwing, who was standing now, and said, Well, we finally caught you 2-8. Where are the other two? What are we tracking for? He angrily asked the three soldiers standing beside the human cell. The first soldier stood tall and answered respectfully. There were only those two at the site along with these three civilians. He gestured towards the three humans in the cage. The older, more decorated man was about to speak when a younger man with red hair spoke up with a slightly angry voice. Why did you capture them? You had direct orders to take the robots and not civilians. His was annoyed, but he had an edge of curiosity and excitement on his words. The second soldier spoke up. The civilians have something to do with the perpetrators. We are not sure what yet, but they are working together somehow, he said unsurely as the red-haired man sighed heavily. The heavily decorated man in the grayish-green suit raised one eyebrow in Silver Spot's direction as he said, That one doesn't look dangerous at all. The red one looks like it could take out our tanks, but the silver one is probably useless. He made that comment with little care and shrugged. Silver Spot was more focused on escaping and dissecting the two men's identities than she was on the insult that had been directed toward her, so she didn't react much. However, Razorwing was furious that the human had such audacity to insult his friend. He slammed himself against the bar, determined to escape and squish the human before him. Razorwing felt an electric shock zap at him, and he stumbled backwards, still unbroken. He glared and huffed at the humans before him. The older man flinched a little, but simply looked up at Razorwing with fascination. The younger, red-haired man jumped backwards and yelled at the older man. Sergeant Kane, stand back from the bars. The red one seems to be provoked, so just step back slowly. He acted like Razorwing was some rabid animal. Then Silver Spot finally figured out how the bars worked. She stood up calmly, letting all of the attention fall to Razorwing. She walked over to the edge of the bars where she could see the computer console attached to the bars clearly. She knew that as soon as she brought out her loaded crossbow, she would most certainly be noticed by the soldiers in the room. Thus, she quickly grabbed it and loaded her arrow. She aimed it quickly and fired one arrow at the console, hitting it directly and made the blue electricity zap from the bars. Then, the bar's electricity vanished and Silver Spot knew how to escape. About 30 minutes earlier, Silver Spot had noticed that the bars were actually very weak compared to her strength. The only two things keeping her from escaping was the illusion that the bars were strong and the electric field coursing through them that would shock her whenever she touched them. She had also noticed that the console controlled the energy that flowed through the bars. This led her to the conclusion that the bar's electricity could be disabled if she destroyed the console. Now, the soldiers had noticed the arrow flying into the console and were calling for backup. To everyone's surprise, they had not thought about Silver Spot's arrows being a threat. During the confusion, Silver Spot grabbed the bars with her bare hands. Good. There was no painfully shocking sensation coursing through her body. She pulled on the bars, and they broke off of the ceiling and floor, allowing Silver Spot to move them out of her way. Razorwing saw what Silver Spot was doing and did the same, both of them successfully escaping the cell. The two men had not moved throughout this encounter, and this made Razorwing confused since all of the soldiers in the room had already fled to get back up. Silver Spot shot the second console and freed the 3 humans. Razorwing was debating whether to hurt the older man or not when Silver Spot put her hand on his shoulder and said, "Let him be, Razorwing. For now." She glared at the older man, and his determined face faltered a little. Silver Spot knew that the man, who was named Sergeant Kane according to the younger man, was not running because of pride. She could just see it on his face. However, she was confused why the second man wasn't running. He also had a determined face, but he didn't have that condescending aura that the other man had and made eye contact with her even though she could kill him instantly. Silver Spot kneeled down and looked directly at the red-haired man as she spoke to him. "You have no fear of me." "Why?" she asked. Her mechanical voice echoed throughout the room, but the young man never flinched. He held eye contact with her as he spoke. "From the information I have gathered from you and your red counterpart, you mean no harm to humans." However, the sergeant doesn't understand that. He gave the sergeant a side eye as Razorwing lifted his head with pride. All 3 of the humans were making sure to stay near Razorwing as he spoke. "You just now noticed that? Who are you anyway, and why are you so determined to put us in those cages?" he asked. The younger man sighed and answered, "I know you have a lot of questions for me, and I also have a lot of questions for you. However, more soldiers are coming, and if you don't get back in those cages, the soldiers will force you into them. I will get your civilian friends out of this situation and get them to safety, but as far as the soldiers know, you too are the enemy." He opened a new, unbreached cage and gestured for the Sentiron to get inside. Razorwing highly didn't want to be contained again, but he knew he didn't have a choice, so he got inside anyway. Silver Spot reluctantly followed him, and the red-haired man closed the cage.